Great. Welcome back to U.S. History class. This is the first installment of my bonus or extra credit lecture series where you don't have to view these. Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain through World War II, and then he actually ends up being Prime Minister again as a really old man in the 1960s, but just a very interesting figure that definitely ties into world history. If this was a world history class, I would probably cover him in a pretty big way, but because it's an American history class, I can't justify spending tons of time on a British leader. He's worth mentioning. We talk about how he ties into the war and how he helped kind of persuade FDR, our president, and kind of change his mind on certain aspects of the war, which I'm going to get into more of that in the near future. Anyway, I thought he is an ideal subject to just hit for one of these bonus lectures because he's a super interesting guy, and I have quite a bit to say about him. But again, it doesn't really tie into our curriculum and what I have to hit for this class. So many historians have said that Winston Churchill was the most influential man of the 20th century. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. That's a pretty subjective thing, and it's very opinion-based. You could probably go a lot of different ways there, but he is a world-renowned figure, no doubt, and he definitely impacted the conflict of World War II, which really kind of reshuffles the balance of power in the world, and he becomes endearing to many, many people out there in Great Britain and America and around the world. A lot of people regard this guy as a hero. Now, like I've talked about before, where I covered Teddy Roosevelt, who's one of my favorite presidents, but I was very clear and said that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't all good or all bad. I would probably put him in the good guy category, but he had a very quirky personality and was all over the place. And he had a lot of people that hated him and a lot of people that loved him. And, you know, he did some good things in his life and some bad things. Winston Churchill is like that too. And I think the vast, vast majority of historical figures, don't necessarily fit right into the good guy or bad guy camp. They're kind of weird and hazy and in that gray area, and they have some things that we really like about them and some things that are not such great qualities, at least by today's standards. But that's also another important thing I want to bring up whenever I hit any of these figures. I think it's super important to judge them by the context of the times in which they lived. If we're going to look at Winston Churchill today and a lot of the stuff he said, he would definitely be considered in modern day terms to be kind of a racist and an imperialist because he was unabashedly pro-British Empire. He thought it was the British people's destiny to have this great empire that spanned the world, and he didn't want to give freedom to many of the other people. A lot of them were, brown-skinned or like minority people around the world, and he very much wanted to keep them under the control of the British Empire. Now, that being said, he has some really great traits about him because he was probably the foremost politician over in Europe who was screaming for years before World War II broke out that the Nazis are bad guys, that Hitler is evil, that we cannot negotiate with this guy. No matter what you give him, he is going to keep pushing and taking more. Now, afterwards, when the war actually breaks out, and then when we find about the Holocaust, that's basically towards the end of the war that all that information starts leaking out and shocks the world. Winston Churchill goes down and he looks like a prophet at that point. Like, man, this guy saw it coming the whole time. So I think World War II and his take on the Nazis, that was something that he got right. And maybe we would have been better off if more people would have listened to Churchill early on in the early days of that conflict, or even before World War II broke out. Now, let's rewind a little bit. Go back to who he was as a person. There are some people in history that are self-made men that, like, man, they start from nothing and they reach the pinnacle and the heights. Andrew Carnegie, if you remember him from back in quarter one, he was a poor Scottish immigrant. He came over and then he ends up being the second wealthiest man in all of human history. Only one of his contemporaries, John Rockefeller, the big oil baron at the time, had more money than Andrew Carnegie did. That's a self-made man to start from basically very humble beginnings and go up that high. Now, Winston Churchill, he's not that guy. His background is a little bit closer to like Teddy Roosevelt when I covered him, where he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He came from a wealthy and privileged family. So it's not like he hit a home run in life. It was like he was maybe born on third base and then just kind of took it the rest of the way. If that analogy makes sense for you, he comes from a very wealthy and privileged family. He never would have had to enter politics or enter the military, but back at that time, it was very common for a lot of like the guys that wanted to get into politics and to be, take leadership positions. It was almost a prerequisite back then that most of these guys did have to go prove themselves on the battlefield. Now, many of them would go enlist into the Navy or into some Army unit where they weren't actually ever going to see any combat. They just needed to get that on their resume. But Winston Churchill, he is much more like Teddy Roosevelt, who I had covered way back in quarter one, where Roosevelt, remember, he wanted to go out and see combat. That was one of his big ambitions in life. He actually regretted not having some scars to show for it. Churchill is kind of sort of on the same thread there. He actually wanted to go enlist. He wanted to go fight. He wanted to see combat as a young man, which is kind of ironically back in 1898, which was the same year Teddy Roosevelt fought in the Spanish-American War, where he led the Rough Riders and up the charge up San Juan Hill to, take the fort from the Spanish. That same year, a young Winston Churchill, he was younger than Teddy Roosevelt, fought in the Battle of Omdurman, which is in what is the modern day country of the Sudan. And he fought against this sheik. It was a Muslim guy who was kind of like the emperor, a big tribal lord at the time. Now, the British Empire, they came in and they were trying to lock down control of the Sudan, this, kind of desert place in Africa. The locals didn't want them there, and they had fought several battles. The British had actually lost a few, and some of their top generals had been killed out in combat fighting against this Muslim sheik. And Churchill was a young guy at the time. He was not leading an army unit. He was just a regular soldier. Now, the British, to their advantage, they had machine guns. They had some small artillery, not quite like World War I style artillery, and their soldiers had like repeating rifles. The Muslim soldiers, even though the Muslim army outnumbered the British 2-1, so huge, very much outnumbered big time. They had much older equipment, basically like old, like Revolutionary War style, like muskets, so they couldn't reload as quick. Anyway, this was a decisive victory for the British, but young Winston Churchill, this made a big impression on him. He definitely understood what combat was. He saw some of his friends die in this battle. He was worried at times in the battle that he was going to die. I guess, he felt like it could have gone either way. And where some guys will go into combat and then it'll change them forever and they'll think warfare is evil and they'll become a pacifist. That wasn't the path that Winston Churchill took. He realized war was grisly, ugly business, but he also took a lot of pride in it, and he wasn't scared of war, and he's actually going to end up having the chance to prove himself again later in life, although he wasn't really intending to do that. So after this, he ends up entering politics. He becomes at a very young age, kind of like Roosevelt. He gets super active in politics and he starts to make a name for himself. He fights corruption. He also has the right family name, has the right connections. He's able to get into the British Parliament at a super young age. And then World War I breaks out. So he is in Parliament. He's a minister of Parliament. He actually had some other kind of in another twist of fate, almost ironically, he ends up becoming essentially like the secretary of the British Navy. So he's not an admiral that's out there like commanding a fleet of ships, but he is like the politician leader of the Navy when World War I breaks out, which that was the same job Teddy Roosevelt had right prior to the Spanish-American War, which I had talked about back when I was doing the lecture series on him. So a lot of similarities and parallels between these two guys. Maybe that's why I kind of like them both so much. Anyway, Winston Churchill, during World War I, he goes and visits the trenches after everything, the fighting breaks out, and he sees, oh man, trench warfare, and we're sending thousands of guys to go try to break through the German lines, and they're just getting mowed down by machine guns. And he's like, initially he's like, this makes no sense at all. It makes no sense to go attack machine guns and use as your weapon the chests of our young men, meaning that you're just throwing guys into a meat grinder and getting them chopped up. So actually, because he was kind of sort of tied into the Navy as one of the top guys there, he actually greenlights the prototype for the very first tanks that are going to be really influential and important by World War II. The very first ones were created by the British in 1915, and Churchill was the guy that greenlit and funded this project. He actually is able to procure and take some big water tanks out of like British naval vessels, and they pretty much rig up a tractor to it, and then they go fine tune it and redesign it. But basically, that's what it was. It was a big water tank. That's where the name came from. It was a water tank from a battleship that they put tracks on, and then they would try to get across no man's land without getting their guys shot, or it would give guys cover to hide behind these tanks as they rolled across no man's land into the German lines. They didn't play too much of they weren't a deciding factor in World War I. If you remember, tanks were really slow. Nobody knew how to use them right, but I do give Winston Churchill the credit for trying to save British young men's lives. Now, one of the biggest blunders he made in his life, his kind of what he thinks is going to be the end of his political career and his total demise in World War I, after this whole tank incident plays out, he thinks the best place to hit the Germans is where they're weakest, or back then it was the Central Powers. And he's eyeing down, he thinks one of the weaker members of the Central Powers alliance was the Turks or the Ottoman Empire. And there is a point down in kind of the Mediterranean Sea where there's this really important sea passage, and there's this little place called Gallipoli. And he masterminds this whole attack where Australian and New Zealand troops, which were essentially British guys. They were born in Australia and New Zealand, but they kind of speak with that British accent. They're part of the British Empire. He sends a whole army of them in with British naval ships, and they try to take this really important key passage. But the Germans had actually come in and backed up and were kind of commanding the Ottoman Turk soldiers, and it was a horrible defeat. And thousands and thousands of Australian, or they call them Anzac troops, because they were from Australia and New Zealand. So Anzac. Lots of these guys died, and it was a huge political blunder and a big failure, and they weren't able to take the sea passage. And after that, he falls from power, and he thinks his career is totally over, and he's done for, and he's a goner in British politics, and he doesn't know what to do. He's depressed and sad. He's now at this point kind of middle-aged, about the age Teddy Roosevelt was when he fought in the Spanish-American War. So what is he to do? He could just retire to his country estate and just be done with it all, but not like a guy like him to just sit down and rest on his laurels. He actually decides to go enlist into the British Army because World War I is going on. And he thinks, man, if there's ever a path to me getting back into politics and restoring my name after making this horrible blunder where thousands of guys died and I get the blame for all of it, he feels like he has to go prove himself on the battlefield. So he's not a super high-ranking officer in the British Army. He actually comes in, and with his name and political connections, I think he came in at like the rank of captain. So he's in command of a small like company of men, like 80 guys or so. So you can think roughly he's about the rank of like Major Whittlesey. He would be one rank below him if you remember that movie, The Lost Battalion. Anyway, I guess he thrived in the trenches. Like if you remember what World War I trench life was like, is miserable. It was horrible. Rats and rain and muck and mire, and you're getting shot at. Well, apparently Winston Churchill, who's kind of looks like a chubby little bulldog out there with chomping his cigars, he thrived in those conditions. And I guess he was always very chipper and happy, and he was just like upbeat. His soldiers liked him, and he ended up being a pretty darn good soldier in World War I. Through doing that, he does kind of restore his name. And then the Allies win World War I. After World War I in the 1920s, he's able, because of that, because he didn't roll over and die, and he had that fighting spirit, he ends up getting back into British politics, and he climbs up the totem pole. And then where I want to pick up next is in the 1930s, Hitler is coming to power. The Allied countries, the French, the British, even the Americans, President Kennedy's dad, Joe Kennedy, who was the ambassador to Great Britain back at this time in roughly 1934, they go in, and this is when Hitler is trying to build things up, and he's trying to take more territory and put all the German-speaking peoples in one country, and they do the Munich Accords. Munich was a city in Germany where all of these guys, the Allied powers and Hitler's representatives, met, and essentially they let Hitler get away with a lot of stuff, and they try to appease him. They try to make him happy to avoid a future war. Well, to his credit, Winston Churchill, through all of this, now he was not the prime minister yet, and he couldn't stop it, but he was the one guy that was out there screaming and saying, we cannot negotiate with Adolf Hitler. He's like, this guy is a monster. I can see it. I've dealt with people like him before. He is going to stab us in the back. It doesn't matter what you give him. He's always going to take more. And then I think history has definitely proven him right. And after the war does break out and Hitler just keeps pushing and taking more and more, and the conflict blows up, Churchill kind of looks like a prophet. And the old British prime minister, his name was Neville Chamberlain, who had appeased Hitler and let him get away with more, he falls out of power early in World War II. And then the Battle of Britain begins, and the British people are getting bombed. I had hit that in a lecture series. Where Hitler is bombing and killing innocent women and children and civilians. At that point, Churchill kind of looks like the prophet. He becomes the British prime minister. He's leading the island. And there was a big cry in Great Britain. A lot of people wanted to basically just surrender to Hitler, and they wanted to have the war done, and they were terrified by these firebombing tactics and stuff that he was doing on London. But Churchill rallies the British people, and he says, no, you cannot surrender to this guy, because if you think it's bad now, just wait till Hitler comes in and takes over our whole country. It's going to get way, way worse. And the British people kind of buy into that, and he rallies them, and they become determined that no matter what, and remember, America's not in the fight at that time. They're standing up against Hitler all by themselves, but they become very determined that they are going to fight back and resist no matter what. They will not surrender to Hitler. So I think Churchill gets a ton of credit for that. At that point, if Britain had surrendered, you potentially, America and Nazi Germany may have not gotten into a war. Maybe they would have, but you really could have had a situation where 80 years later in 2020, there is still a Nazi-controlled Europe, and then there is a American-controlled like Western Hemisphere, where those two powers may have never been able to dislodge each other. All right, what I'm going to leave you with: Churchill is a man of quotes. He kind of has a way with words, and I want to read 3 of his quotes off that are my personal favorites from him. So during the Battle of Britain, when every day, every night, Hitler is sending over bombers, and he's trying to get the British people to surrender, and he's bombing London and killing anybody he can. He's just terrorizing the British people. Churchill looks at the guys, the last line of defense kind of from these German bombers, which was the young men, the pilots of the Royal Air Force. These were the British Spitfire pilots. They're fighter planes that would go up and try to shoot down the German planes. And he says, never have so many owed so much to so few. When he said that, never have so many people owed so much to so few, or to so few. He's talking about, the British people, this whole island of millions of people that's getting terrorized by the Nazis, that they really all owe a great debt to the couple thousand young men who were pilots in the British Royal Air Force. And there was actually a handful of American guys that went over there and were being pilots too, kind of like the Ben Affleck character in that scene from the movie Pearl Harbor I showed you, because a lot of their pilots were getting shot down. Royal Air Force pilots, on average, I think at that point in the war, were lasting about 4 or 5 weeks before they died. That was their life expectancy. So it was almost a sure thing that you were going to get shot down. It was just a matter of how long. So anyway, he's grateful for those guys for sacrificing so much to try to keep the island safe. Next quote: right after the Pearl Harbor attack, when America now is involved in the war, and then Hitler declares war on us, Winston Churchill he was very good friends with our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he had actually been trying to talk FDR in America to joining the war and helping them out and coming over to fight the Nazis for years. He has been begging us to help them because he realizes that if America joins in too, that's another really big, powerful country, and the odds of the British and the Allied powers winning the war would go up tremendously if America joined their side. So anyway, I always found this quote kind of funny. He said about America, "You can always count on America to do the right thing once they have exhausted all other options." LOL. So it's like you can always count on America to do the right thing and show up and be the good guys once they've tried every other thing that they could possibly do to get out of doing the right thing. Because who knows if America would have ever joined up in the conflict had the Pearl Harbor attack not happened. And then final one for you, and I think this one really rings true, especially into today's climate. In 1947, 2 years after World War II was done, Winston Churchill says to the British Parliament that essentially democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. So think about that. We're living through a time where we're in a democracy, a republic actually, but we have a lot of democratic principles. But it seems like people are more divided and polarized, and there's more bickering and fighting than ever before. And it does make you think that, man, is this the right form of government? It seems kind of rotten, but I think Churchill's quote kind of hits it on the head that, democracy, having votes like that where the people have a say, it is kind of a rotten form of government, and the people can be very fickle, but it's better than all the other kinds. That if you look at dictatorships or monarchies or things like that, essentially they usually don't function as good, and the people don't have as high a standard of living. So I think he's kind of a wise man. He definitely has some pros and cons. I didn't get into the cons or the downside because he has a lot of detractors too, a lot of people that would accuse him of being racist and whatnot. But I think if you look at the whole picture of this guy, at least in my opinion, he overall would go more to the good guy category than the bad guy category. So hopefully you enjoyed the lecture on him. I plan on coming out with a couple more in the near future. See ya.